Okay, you did a great job on drawing pictures and writing about your favorite part. Here's our last activity today, okay? This is something that we're going to be working with a lot for the rest of the year. And it's called, these two circles that are overlapping are called a Venn diagram. You don't need to know that name. You'll get used to it from hearing it all year long. And in a Venn diagram, do you see where I wrote Roberto up here? Mm-hmm. And I wrote Mr. Sanchez over here? Mm-hmm. We're going to think of words that only belong over here that describe Roberto. And then we're going to think of words that only describe Mr. Sanchez. And then we're going to think of words that could mean either one of them. Okay? So for example, is Roberto young or old?
Young.
Young. Okay, so only Roberto is young. So I'm writing young over there. And what is Mr. Sanchez?
Old.
Old. Okay, can you tell me another word to describe Mr. Sanchez or Roberto?
Nice.
Okay. Is one of them nice or are both of them nice?
Both nice.
So where should I put that? I think you guys got the hang of this. Okay. So I'm going to put nice in the middle there, okay? Can you think of another word to describe Roberto? How did he feel in the story?
Sad.
Sad.
Okay. Was Mr. Sanchez sad?
No.
No. So only Roberto was sad. How was Mr. Sanchez feeling when...
Happy.
Happy.
Do you think he was happy? Why was he happy?
Because he had a good time.
He had a good time. He was doing what he liked to do. Okay, so now let me just ask you this question. Should I put happy only under Mr. Sanchez, or should I put happy someplace else? At the end of the story, what happened? Was only Mr. Sanchez happy?
No.
So where should I put happy? Use your words instead of pointing. Tell me where.
In the middle.
Why in the middle?
Because they were both happy at the end.
Okay, so they're both happy. Let's look through the book and see if we can see any pictures that might tell us some other words to describe Mr. Sanchez and Roberto. Okay, is Mr. Sanchez, are they the same size?
No.
Well,
No.
how are they different?
Well,
He's big.
He's
big and old.
He's big and he's smaller than he.
Okay. So what's another word to describe a person who's big?
Giant.
Oh, well, that is a word, but what's another word that begins with a t sound? You are very t. Do you know the word tall?
Tall.
Very tall. So is Roberto tall or is Mr. Sanchez tall?
Mr. Sanchez.
Mr. Sanchez is tall. And if Mr. Sanchez is tall and Roberto is not, what is Roberto?
Small.
Small, or do you know a word that starts with this sound? Shh. That's
Short.
not short, okay? Okay. So now this is a really hard question, I think. I'm going to talk about the word lonely. Okay? Who was feeling lonely, or were both of them feeling lonely?
Both of them.
Do you think so? Now, I want you to think about Mr. Sanchez. Even though Mr. Sanchez was alone.
He still had the finches and his dog.
Right. Mr. Sanchez was alone, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he was lonely.
Actually, he was lonely since he had to.
Okay.
He's like left out.
So he was feeling left out. So should I put lonely under Roberto or under both of them?
Under Roberto.
Okay. So I'm going to put lonely under Roberto. Who was alone? Was Roberto alone?
He wasn't really alone.
Mr. Sanchez.
Mr. Sanchez used to go to the park alone. So he was alone, but was Roberto also alone?
No. He had all the other kids, but he wasn't in the game.
Okay, so I can appreciate that distinction. We're going to say that Mr. Sanchez was alone, and you're saying that Roberto was with other kids, but he wasn't part of the group, so he was lonely. That's an interesting distinction. It's really different. Okay, let's see what else we can see before we wrap this up. Because the whole point of looking at this Venn diagram is to learn more about the characters or about places and to see what's the same and what's different. Okay. You told me before, Emily, that you drew in your picture that you were really happy and you really liked your favorite part in the book was when Roberto was throwing that ball and he had his hands up in the air, right? I don't know if I can find that picture. But how,
It's somewhere at the end.
I should just look at your picture because it was so good. How did he feel? How did Roberto feel when he did that? When he threw that, here it is, here's your favorite picture. How did he feel?
Good.
Happy.
Happy. See, his face comments that it's happy.
Could I say that he was elated? Do you know what elated means? Elated is like super happy. If you're
Yeah.
elated, you can say he was elated when he threw the ball. That's really happy. So he's elated. Was he the only one that was elated?
No.
How do you think Mr. Sanchez is feeling
Elated.
there? Elated. So where should I put elated? Right under happy. Were they elated in the beginning of the story or at the end of the story?
At the end.
At the end of the story. And so even though we already wrote happy, we've learned a new word. So I just want to close up our lesson by looking at Mr. Sanchez and Roberto on this paper. Can you see right here? And we can see that they were different. Mr. Sanchez is what? What's underneath Mr. Sanchez?
Old, tall, alone,
He's old, tall, and alone, but he's also
nice, happy,
elated. Oh, at the end of the story. And then Roberto is,
young, sad, short, lonely.
but he does change, right?
Yeah,
We
he
talked
changed.
about that in the beginning of the story. How do the characters change? And how did Roberto change?
Wait.
Yep.
Why is there lonely and nice?
And happy? Well, that's what I'm getting at. In the beginning of the story, Roberto was sad and lonely. But how was he at the end of the story?
Happy.
Actually, we said he was elated. So how did he change?
He changed to be really sad all the time to being really happy all the time.
So that's what made him a little bit more like Mr. Sanchez. They were both happy at the end because they had found each other and helped each other.
And they made friends.
And they made friends. Do you think that it's possible that Mr. Sanchez was just as happy to help Roberto as Roberto was to have Mr. Sanchez help him? They really helped each other. Okay, so that's great. So we answered one of the questions that we had started with before we read the story. I asked you to think about how they changed and think about how their friendship started and how it grew. Now, before we end, I want to ask you this question. What can we put under that L column on our KWL chart? What did you learn from the story?
That they're different, but they're both. They're different, but they're both. But they just because you're different doesn't mean you can become friends.
Just because you're different doesn't mean that you can't be friends, and that. What else? How did the children who wouldn't let Roberto play with them because they thought he wasn't a very good athlete, they thought he was not a very good kickball player, how did they change how they thought at the end of the story?
They thought he was a really good kickball player at the end.
He was the kickball champ. So we learned, look in our W column, we wanted to know if you can judge a person's abilities by how they look.
No.
And can you?
No.
No. All right, I want to thank you for being such good readers and good thinkers. Are your brains tired?
No.
Okay, ladies, we're all done with our book for today. What did you think about today's book or this week's book?
I loved it.
You loved it?
I loved it so much.
Can you tell me why?
Because they both he turned out sad, but then he made a new friend.
And he became happy.
And then
They both
he became a really great kickball player.
Great. And you know what sometimes they call this? Like an underdog story, where the guy
Underdog.
who's the underdog suddenly rises to the top. Can you guys give me a good high five? Ready? Bingo. Good job.